Coming up on Chopper's Political Podcast.
Okay, Tom, the third takeaway for this one.
Let's talk about rabbits.
Welcome back to Chopper's Political Podcast, where I bring you the best guest gossip and stories from our studio in the heart of Westminster here at GB News. I'm Christopher Hope, the political editor. Socialism is back, big time. Chancellor Rachel Reeves has announced her budget, finally kick-starting this Labour government's work with a massive punt on the state to sort out the country's woes. There are billions of pounds for the NHS as well as other infrastructure projects funded by billions of pounds of new tax increases. If you need a reminder that Labour had won their 170 seat plus majority in July, sweeping away the old Tory order, this is it. And that's our focus on today's Chopper's Political Podcast. Later, we'll be finding out how some of that money might be spent on big government spending projects like HS2 and why these schemes often go massively awry, with Andrew Gilligan, a former advisor on transport in City Hall and in 10 Downing Street. But first, GB News' Deputy Political Editor Tom Harwood is here to pick apart the politics of this budget and tell us what he thinks the Chancellor's gamble on the state solving the UK ills is and whether it might work. And Gerard, Lyons, the City economist and a senior fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies, he's here to tell us whether Rachel Reeves' gamble on the state is as big as the one that Liz Truss took on growth 2 years ago and how the City might react. So Tom Harwood, Gerard Lyons, welcome to Chopper's Political Podcast. Gerard Lyons, to you first. Just summarise in a tweet what the budget's about. What just happened?
Well, this is a tax, spend and borrow budget. For the Chancellor, the focus is very much on boosting public investment and spending on the infrastructure. That's to be welcome, but it's come at a big price. The government has inherited a moderately improving economy, but it's also inherited a very poor fiscal position and a high level of debt. This budget, though, hasn't really addressed that. And the best backdrop to address the debt problem that the government inherited is stronger economic growth and reform of the public services.
Yes.
But what we have had in this budget is a huge fiscal boost, totalling £208 billion over the next 5 years.
A fiscal boost means what in layman's terms?
That's the difference between government spending and government taxation. So each year over the next 5 years, the government is going to be spending £83 billion more than was planned back in March when Jeremy Hunt was Chancellor. That's going to be funded by increased taxation of just shy of £40 billion per year. And it's also going to be funded by increased borrowing of around £30 billion per year. So a big budget in terms of scale, big budget in terms of the size of the stake continuing to rise, and to fund it through higher taxation and higher borrowing.
Before I go to Tom Harwood on what the five political takeaways from this, she was keen to put this budget, wasn't she, Gerard Lyons, in a historical context to justify the scale of it.
That's right. At the beginning of the budget, the Chancellor mentioned 3 previous years when Labour has taken office, 1945, 1964 and 1997. But there was also another year when Labour won office that she failed to mention, which I think is more relevant for this budget, and that was 1974. See, the 70s were a very difficult economic environment, both here in the UK and globally. Then the worry was inflation. Now it's an equally difficult global backdrop and a very challenging environment in the UK. Low growth and high debt is the problem, as opposed to high inflation as in the 70s. But it's a similar set of challenges. Then Labour only had a small majority of around 6 seats. Now they have a much bigger majority. But the question is whether this budget will deliver economically, and also obviously the political challenge as to whether they had the mandate to raise taxes in the way they did.
Well, we'll come to that. I mean, overnight we're seeing the economic verdicts are in, Tom Harwood. The Resolution Foundation says we're on course now for the lowest increase in living standards under any Labour PM since 1955. And we were told, weren't we, during that election campaign, that any tax cuts or anything will be funded by growth by Keir Starmer. But what will this budget apparently not deliver?
Well, growth. It's interesting, isn't
Growth
it?
in a big way, anyway.
This is significant because I was going to come on to this later, but let's dive straight in. Growth is going to be lower over the course of the 5-year period than the previous OBR assessments under the previous government. What has happened is in the first 2 years, growth estimates are up ever so slightly, not up to American levels or anything like that. We're still at best around 2% of GDP growth. But by the end of the 5-year forecast period, by 2029, it goes down to 1.6. That's lower than the previous estimates were under the previous government. Rachel Reeves says that with the new 10-year forecast, it picks up a little bit because of some of that infrastructure investment that's being done through that extra borrowing. But it is really, really stark that a budget that is designed to be pro-growth, that an agenda that is predicated upon higher growth, actually in this 5-year period sees lower growth as assessed by the OBR.
Is that your first of the 5 takeaways you want to talk about, the lack of growth?
That was going to come a bit later, but I think it's interesting and it's very, very pertinent for what this government is going to be able to do throughout this parliament. But I think there is one big number one political takeaway, and it's the headline. It's the number one thing that everyone will think of when they hear this budget: £40 billion in extra tax. This is a tax-raising budget. We can't escape that huge, huge tax question. And that becomes a trust question as well for so many people, because this was a party, this is now a government, that got into government on the back of promises on tax. The real question, the real political question, is will people see this national insurance rise as a manifesto breach?
Do you think we shouldn't be surprised, Gerard Lyons, a government with so many MPs in Parliament should do this? This is, are we now waking up to the fact we have had 14 years of Tory rule when tax was a bad word, a word which is to be traduced? This is a government which likes the word tax.
Well, right, let's take the positive about the budget. It is an attempt to address the low level of investment in the UK. UK investment has been historically very low, both public investment and also private investment. Now, ideally, to get investment up, you need to be incentivising the private sector. And also you need to be getting the city to close the big funding gaps that have existed for some time. The lack of investment to support finance the small firms, the lack of patient capital. Now, this budget was very much headline addressing low public investment.
Yes.
And as Tom's mentioned, the OBR does assume that that benefits growth, but much further out. The challenge, of course, it adds to borrowing in the near term. While that good is the public investment side and trying to boost overall investment, the challenge from this budget is that it hits the private sector hard.
By squeezing them out, maybe?
Yeah, well, particularly small and medium-sized firms, by raising national insurance, and you're squeezing out, this is a key economic term, does higher public investment, as the Chancellor said in her budget, crowd in, that is, encourage the private sector to spend more, or does it crowd out the private sector?
It could make labour shortages worse, for example, in construction, drive up bills, that kind of thing. Tom?
Yeah, well, certainly. And I was going to say, actually, the OBR does assume that not all of the benefits of higher taxes from national insurance comes to the revenue, because they actually assume some of this is going to be offset by firms squeezing wages and squeezing salaries, and higher national insurance is a tax on jobs.
Well, that is absolutely what they say. I've got the blue book in my hands here, which is published every year by the OBR alongside the red book that is the budget. So
Tom's waving it around for listeners who can't see.
I'll rustle it a little bit so that people can hear. But it says it here in black and white from the OBR that wages are expected to grow in the first 2 years, but, and now I quote, real earnings then stall in 2026 and 2027 as firms rebuild margins and pass on the cost of higher employer NICs. That is there in black and white from the OBR, which Rachel Reeves has, of course, venerated as the body that should be most trusted on all economic
10 weeks
questions.
to do all the work on it, yeah.
And they are saying there in black and white that these national insurance rises will mean lower wages. And in their forecast, set against inflation, which is deemed to be 0.5% higher than it otherwise would have been because of that extra borrowing, according to the OBR, set against that inflation environment, real wages fall in 2026 and 2027. That's the assessment of the OBR.
Going back to your point on the manifesto breach, this is what the PM now, Sir Keir Starmer, told me for GB News. We had one interview with him during the campaign. He said this. The Labour's plans do not involve tax rises over and above the ones set out in relation to non-dom status and private equity loopholes, VAT on private schools, and of course a windfall tax on oil and gas companies. That's in the manifesto. So they've gone beyond where they were. I mean, yes or no, Gerard Lyons, have they breached their manifesto with you said there, the tax on workers, didn't you?
Well, okay, employers' national insurance is a tax on companies. So technically they haven't. But the cost of it, as Tom's just touched on, is passed on to staff. And that's assumed from the OBR, and I think is correct. On the positive, the Chancellor did raise index allowances after 2028. Basically, for coming years, and the total of 7 years, income tax allowances have not increased with inflation. So people are dragged into higher tax brackets if their wages and salaries
drag
rise.
Idea.
But from 2028, against expectations, the Chancellor has reinserted that allowance. So basically it goes up in line with inflation. So that's
just
good.
ahead of the next election, so that's political.
But the challenge is this. If the economy is not growing strongly and your debt level is high, you then have to do something. And you've got really 5 choices to get debt under control. You grow the economy, you reform, you raise taxes, you cut public spending, or you borrow more. Growth is not going to be particularly strong. Reform was mentioned yesterday, but we need to see it in terms of the public sector. Spending is not going down, it's going up for a whole variety of reasons. So therefore, to square it all up, you therefore have to tax more or you have to borrow more. There's no getting away from that. And if growth doesn't deliver, then the challenge is there. One of the real issues is that we have a comprehensive spending review next year. And in all likelihood, the growth picture,
spending over
next 3 years. So spending might be under further upward pressure. If that happens, and also if growth disappoints, or also if inflation proves stubborn and interest rates don't come down, then we're going to have the issues we've talked about yesterday and this morning being issues we talk about next year and the year after. That is, debt is the big problem and you have to address it. You need to keep the markets on side and borrow more. But unfortunately, it means taxes are under upward pressure unless you do something dramatic.
Tom, do you have a second takeaway from this budget?
Yeah, I think we should touch on inflation because it has been the most pernicious sort of real income eating aspect of the last 5 years or so, or at least since the pandemic. And we've seen this the world over, where there has been high inflation, where there have been interest rate rises, incumbent governments have done really, really poorly.
And what's your forecast on inflation?
Inflation is going to be 0.5% higher than it otherwise would have been. So that's a little bit higher than the sort of 2% target. We're going to get up to around 2.5,
all the way till 2030, I think, isn't it? It won't go below 2 till then, will it?
That's right. And the real interesting thing that the OBR have modelled off the back of this is higher interest rates than otherwise they would have been. So that's 25 basis points higher than the previous forecast. Now, this matters because look around the world where incumbent governments have done really, really poorly in recent elections. I mean, despite strong growth in the United States, Kamala Harris's campaign is really struggling on the question of prices, on the question of does the dollar in your pocket buy as much as it did 4 years ago? Similarly, look at Olaf Scholz in Germany, where he's really, really struggling. Down in Australia, there's going to be a flip of government there. Almost everywhere you look, Canada's another great example. Trudeau is 20 points behind in the polls. What is Pierre Poilievre and the Canadian Conservatives talking about? Prices and inflation. Wherever
I think it's about a dozen eggs in America, I think. That's what they're waving around, isn't it?
That's right. Prices. Well, that's why the comparison with the 1970s is really relevant. And Tom's quite right. People often talk about rate of inflation, but for the general public, it's the cost of living crisis. Because even though inflation here is now down at 1.7%, the level of prices is almost a fifth to a quarter higher than it was 3 years ago. So people are still paying the consequences of really poor Bank of England monetary policy. Inflation may be lower, but the cost of living crisis
is that
still
a Liz
bites.
Truss hangover, though, the still maintained high prices?
Well,
concerns about that?
I wouldn't attribute it to Liz Truss. The two key factors then were that we've seen contributing to higher inflation have been lax monetary policy and supply side shocks. The mini budget of 2 years ago was a fiasco because Then the Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, and Liz Truss didn't keep the markets on side. They didn't prepare. They actually hit the markets with unexpected tax cuts.
And that hasn't happened this time, has it?
No.
So overnight, the IMF is delighted with what's happened.
Although
Tom?
cost of gilt, gilt yields, the cost of
That's
government
borrowing, yep.
has risen fairly markedly.
Well, okay, in the backdrop in the last few weeks has been for yields to rise, not just here in the UK, but globally as well. Certainly, immediately after the budget yesterday, Tom's right, gilt yields did rise. They stabilised slightly, but the markets...
And that can signify what to listeners?
Well, basically, it's a high cost of borrowing for the UK. The markets have sort of not given the full thumbs up that the IMF has given to this budget, but the markets are saying, we don't really like the increased borrowing, but therefore we have to take that into account how we price UK government debt and the rate at which the UK government can borrow. But for the moment, we're actually stabilising because we're going to watch how both the growth numbers, the inflation interest rate picture and the borrowing sort of pans out over the next few years. The Debt Management Office, which controls the borrowing of whoever's in government in the UK, yesterday came out with their latest figures. And this is quite a big increase. Gilt sales, the amount of government debt that needs to be sold to the markets, is up by 19.2 billion this year. The government is borrowing close to 300 billion, to be precise, 296.9 billion of gilts from UK pensions funds, insurance companies, and also international investors, and an extra 3 billion of treasury bills as well. So that's a huge amount of borrowing. The important thing, therefore, is to keep the markets on side. This is a challenge not just for Britain, it's for America, it's also for France. But Britain and France are the two G7 countries who rely more on international borrowing than anyone else. So we not only need to keep the city comfortable, we need to keep international investors on side. And the worry is if borrowing and debt is not kept under control, or if growth disappoints. And the big issue in the next few years is that high level of debt at some stage needs to be addressed.
Yes.
You can't get away from that.
Okay, Tom, the third takeaway for this one.
Let's talk about rabbits, because this was not necessarily, well, it was sold as a budget.
Surprises, you mean, don't you?
Yes,
by
rabbits out of the hats, which we love at a budget. But we were told this was going to be a rabbit-free budget.
Yes.
We were told this was going to be a sort of a bleak landscape exterminated of any sort of wildlife, of any fauna or indeed flora. But what we did see was at least two significant rabbits.
Yes.
Number one, on fuel duty. There were huge fears that the fuel duty escalator would kick back into gear, that the price at the pump would yet again rise.
Yes.
Rachel Reeves could have very easily not done anything and allowed that escalator to kick back in. Those were what was in the forecasts at the last budget. And yet she continued what has become a time-honoured tradition in British politics for the last 14 years. The OBR every year suggests that fuel duty will rise, will go back on that escalator, and every year the Chancellor announces, no it won't, we are extending the freeze. And it's interesting to see.
That's surprising to you. They're ramping up bus tickets by 50%, but making petrol cheaper. How's that work with the net zero target?
Or keeping petrol at the same price that it was, keeping that cut that we saw, that further cut actually that we saw during COVID.
Yeah.
Really interesting. I don't think many people expected that a few weeks out from the budget. That was a political choice of the Chancellor.
I thought that was really good, actually. The UK is a very imbalanced economy. We talk about London versus the rest, but other imbalances are urban versus rural, coastal versus inland. And some of those areas that continue to suffer are very dependent on the car. Public transport is not as good as it should be. And therefore, not raising fuel duty, I think, was a real big positive for rural and also
would have added £4.50 to the typical car, 5p on it, would have reversed the Rishi Sunak cut in March.
Yes. And one we're giving the Chancellor a hard time this morning, it seems. She has been keen to address public investment. She has, as we mentioned, increased indexing on allowances. She has not raised the fuel duty. And I think she is very keen to keep the markets on side. So there's a political aspect to this budget, very much public sector, trade unions, but also conscious of the cost of living crisis. And she is mindful of the fact that despite this borrowing being very high, she has to sort of not shock the markets. So the surprises were on the positive side, not on the negative side.
Yes, although it does sort of go against the narrative that this wasn't a budget concerned with politics, this is a budget concerned with, quote unquote, fixing the foundations and being very serious and not afraid to be unpopular and all of this sort of stuff. Actually, there is some popular stuff in here.
Yes.
And the other one, of course,
Your second
is the issue of fiscal drag, those frozen thresholds we mentioned earlier on income tax, which have been frozen, were frozen by Rishi Sunak, dragged many people into higher tax brackets than they really should be in.
Yes.
And interestingly, we had briefing from the Treasury weeks and weeks out from the budget saying, we're going to have to extend this freeze on the thresholds, we're going to have to extend this for years and years. And so the announcement, the rabbit, wasn't actually a change to government policy. It was a shift of media expectation.
Yes.
So I wonder if really a very clever game has been played here by some boffins at the Treasury to drip out some real gruesome news that they were never really planning to do in the budget anyway.
Yes.
So that when the budget is delivered, people think, oh, that's not as bad as it could have been. Was this really a real rabbit? Or was it an imaginary rabbit? A pretend invisible
Alice in
conjured
Wonderland rabbit maybe, but they still have pushed up Nick's by 25 billion quid a year. One of my takeaways was this graph on page 45.
It's great how we talk about graphs on podcasts, isn't
but
it?
look at it's a real retail issue here. Mortgage rates going up under this government. Now, why is this happening? It said the detail here.
This is only a forecast. Okay.
When the OBR, for listeners, I better say what it is. They're saying the average interest rates on mortgages is 3.7% in 2024, going to 4.5% by 2027, staying at that level until the end of this decade, higher than if the Tories were in post, according to their March forecast. So why are mortgage rates in a worse shape under Labour than the Tory party, Gerard?
Right. Two things here. First, even though we're treating all these forecasts with the respect they deserve, which is important, we have to bear in mind the margin of error on forecasts is particularly high, especially in such an uncertain economic climate. That means spending and taxation and borrowing could all adjust quite significantly. And that leads on to the second point. The interest rate forecast, the projection here, is based both on expectations of inflation and how it impacts the Bank of England, and on expectations about how borrowing influences markets. Clearly, if you're borrowing more, that can exert upward pressure on borrowing yields.
So that increase is caused by Rachel Reeves' policy decision today?
It's caused partly by that, and also coming back to what Tom was touching on earlier. Higher interest rates are an underlying theme throughout this budget document. Higher interest rates compared to expectations earlier this year. And that's both international as well as domestic factors. The issue here that comes back to your question is about inflation. Inflation currently is below the 2% Bank of England target.
Yeah.
But the OBR has raised its expectations of inflation in coming years because of policy measures announced in this budget, as well as their projections.
So there's a price to be paid in mortgages, Tom Harwood, from this budget for listeners, viewers, millions of Brits.
The extraordinary political takeaway of this is that this government will no doubt say that this is sort of a broader market move and all the rest of it, but these are the same people who directly attributed inflation rising and mortgage rates rising to Liz Truss's mini budget. Now, despite the fact that, of course, the Bank of England base rate was not out of line with the Bank of Canada base rate, with the Federal Reserve base rate, with the Bank of Australia base rate, with the European Central Bank base rate, despite the fact that all of these banks rose their interest rates at around the same time, almost more uniquely in this country than anywhere else, there was direct political blame attached to the Prime Minister in a way that there was less direct blame attached to those other central banks and those other governments. But it's interesting that now this same thing is happening, albeit to a lesser degree. Will the same amount of political blame be placed upon the Chancellor?
A mortgage penalty, if you like, Gerard.
Well, there's the political element that Tom's touched on. Looking at this from a financial markets perspective, there is a significant change. In the last few years, markets were very much focused on inflation. and the UK's lack of inflation credibility and hitting the markets by shock with those fiscal numbers 2 years ago clearly was a problem, a self-made problem in number 11, to be quite frank, or number 10 then. The markets, though, were then focused on inflation. Now the market's focus is on growth. And in coming years, the market's focus will likely be on debt. The analogy in terms of budgets that has come to the fore since yesterday is more with Norman Lamont's budget of 1993. Now, it's traditional that in the budget immediately after a general election, taxes tend to go up, whoever is in power, even if it was the Conservatives, as we know from 2010, albeit a coalition. In the Lamont budget to 1993, taxes went up in proportionate terms by even more than Rachel Reeves's yesterday, although it was the second highest tax raising budget in modern times. But at the time of Lamont, to offset his fiscal tightening, higher taxes, interest rates were coming down sharply and the pound had weakened significantly. So the economy was given a big growth boost from monetary policy and a weaker
With foreign
pound.
investors coming in.
Yeah, and the sterling is stable now, which is good. But what we need now is not only that higher public investment to kick in and confidence to return, we actually need to actually see interest rates come down. The outlook for any economy depends on the interaction between the economic fundamentals, policy and confidence. We know what the fundamentals are. We talked about policy. The big unknown is confidence, not just confidence of the markets, but confidence of firms and people.
We're not there yet, are we? Yeah.
And just
Tom
a little
Harwood.
supplementary to your mortgage rates graph, the very next graph,
Yes.
the companion graph
Yes.
in the OBR Blue Book is house prices.
Yes.
Now, homeowners listening to this might actually be a little bit chirped.
You better
by
say, what
this.
does it say, Tom, in your graph there?
Well, they were expected, house prices that is, were expected to fall in 2025 and 2026, being lower than they were in 2024. Now they're rising. Now, perhaps due to the general inflationary environment, perhaps due to the lack of credibility on real planning reform, but we might get onto that a little bit later. The OBR has some words to say about that. House prices are now expected to not fall in any single year and instead to kick back up to trend, rise.
Why
and
is that? If they're
rise
building
and
more
rise.
homes, why are prices going up?
Well,
Tom
are
Harwood?
they building more homes?
Ah.
So there are two sides to this coin, and I'm going to find the right passage that the OBR write about. It's one of the things that the Treasury kept pointing to me yesterday when I was talking about the growth expectations of this government, because the growth expectations of this government, as we've been discussing, are lower than they would like. They point me to this paragraph, page 76
Yes.
of the OBR Blue Book, saying that the government has proposed changes to the planning policy framework, the planning system.
yes.
These changes are yet to be finalised. And
Which is true, to be fair to them,
which is
isn't it?
true. And there's still a consultation being processed
Which is also
by the
true.
government, also true. As such, there is insufficient certainty to adjust current forecasts, especially around implementation, given past reform attempts. What does that mean in plain English?
Well, yes.
Government after government has tried to do planning reform before. Liz Truss tried to do it with her
Yes.
investment zones. Boris Johnson tried to do it with the Planning for the Future white paper. David Cameron tried to
Yes.
do it with Nick Bowles' attempts to
Yes.
liberalise the system. All of them
They've got
failed.
scars on their back, Tom. from
All
that.
of them failed. So the OBR here is saying, okay, you say you're going to do planning reform,
But there's no proof it's
you
gonna
say
happen.
you're going to make it easier to build houses. We don't
I think
believe
that's
you until you actually do it.
Maybe caught wise the OBR. I'll also maybe add to your graph there with the one on page 28, which has net migration at over 300,000 a year to the end of the decade.
Averaging 325. Yes.
Yeah. Now, is that a worry? Is that what? It's not a worry. Is that a worry for us? You know, we are told that the more net migration we have, we are less per capita well off, aren't we, Gerard?
Yeah, per capita GDP is still expected to rise through the forecast horizon. But of course, if migration was on the scale we've seen in recent years, that might change slightly. The issue with migration is that the impact it might have on deterring firms to invest, or the impact it might have on firms into deterring them from upskilling their current staff.
Yeah.
Clearly, the UK needs to have a sensible approach to migration, but it reimposes the problems on housing that's been talked about. The real issue, when you step back, are not only the points we've raised, but if you're looking internationally, it's our point of comparison in the UK is often with Western Europe. The UK has outperformed the other major economies in Western Europe in recent years. The four major economies of Western Europe are Germany, France, Italy, and the UK. Now, Spain this year is likely to be growing strongly, but they're not in the G7. But when one looks internationally, our term of reference really needs to start to be with the growth economies of the Indo-Pacific. We need to turn that global atlas around and look at it with India on the west and America on the east. Trans-Pacific, not transatlantic.
This is a Brexit conversation now, isn't it?
No, it's not. This is a growth conversation. It's about how you actually... It comes back to your point about purchasing power parities, and it comes back to per capita GDP. Basically, the UK's living standards have dipped relative to those in the States. To compete and to be internationally attractive, we need to be competing with those growth economies. And the challenges we face in the UK are not peculiar to us. They're faced by many Western economies, but particularly the economies in Western Europe.
Okay. Tom Harwood, she wants to cut spending, doesn't she, by 2%?
This is interesting. This is interesting because there are several different interpretations of these departmental spending cuts. I think they're probably a bit of fiction, because we are going to get more budgets in this Parliament. But the fiction, as has been laid out, of these departmental spending sort of arrangements is, yes, some of them are going to be getting real terms cuts. The NHS is the standout winner.
Protected,
it's
seems.
Getting 25 billion quid extra. I mean, that's
over 2 years.
Over 2 years, but it's an extraordinary amount of money, given that the election was fought on with the Labour Party saying they were going to give the NHS £2.5 billion extra. I mean, this is 10 times as much.
Well, the Chancellor was clear, though, that 2% reform, so to speak, was a part and parcel of not just increased spending in this budget, but as part and parcel of the agreement in the comprehensive spending review. And it comes back to the issue that you need to not only have economic growth, you need to have reform, because it's about not just the quantity, it's about the quality.
But some areas not touched. The Tory party's manifesto was built on welfare reform, wasn't it? Savings in the welfare budget. Apart from the 2%, there's nothing else here driving down costs in welfare. The benefits bill, getting people to work, Brits to work.
Yeah, that's the big...
It's not being talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was an underlying issue before, and it shows that this is a complex area and some of the underlying issues still remain there after this budget.
Rebecca, who's the wonderful producer, is saying we've got to wind this up. We could talk all day, I think. But listen quickly, Tom Harwood, to you. What's going to unravel in this budget? Where are the problems?
People are going to have lower pay than they otherwise would have.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it all comes back to how people feel. If real wages are falling, as the OBR expects in 2026 and 2027, that has political implications. I just want to mention one more thing if we have time, and that's they've established the Office of Value for Money. This is all about trying to get value for money out of public procurement, out of government contracts.
Why can't civil servants do it without being told?
But you know who the guy they've got to sort of lead this quango, the Office for Value for Money, David Goldstone. He comes from HS2.
We'll come on to HS2 shortly. There are some issues around the £1 million inheritance issue with farmers. I think that level might go up to maybe like 2 or 3 or 4 million, because a lot of farmers are very upset right now. Steve Reed, of course, is in Colombia. He's the guy in charge of farmers. He may want to get back pretty quickly to deal with that row. Also, the issue of widows' pensions and pensions being kept outside of estates when people die. That could be an issue, I think, maybe.
Yeah, well,
there's small areas given your
there's been
macro picture.
There's been different views on these overnight, but from a macro perspective, this was a tax, spend and borrow budget. On the positive was the attempt to address the UK's low rate of investment, higher infrastructure spending, higher spending on the green economy, improving the supply side. That's the positive.
Yes.
The challenge is how the higher taxes impact small and medium-sized firms and how that plays through. And the OBR in their forecasts have said that growth is going to have a sugar rush in the next couple of years, but then growth will disappoint because of some of those negative impacts from higher taxes.
She might come back for more, do you think? Because this is meant to be this is it for 4 or 5 years.
The
now.
Markets would have liked the issue of debt to be addressed head on, whoever had won this election. Higher growth is part and parcel of that. And if growth disappoints, or if growth doesn't really materially pick up, then we're going to have to readdress this debt problem at some stage.
And there's one final issue which has been raised overnight. Do you think low growth might mean that people might look at the EU next election and campaign to rejoin the EU after the next? Is the next election a Brexit election, do you think? Gerard Lyons.
Well, we've only just had an election. I think it's important to stress that the challenges the UK face are long-standing. They were not solved by a membership of the EU. One has to remember that Western Europe is a slow growth region of the global economy, and that Germany and Italy have underperformed us in recent years. France and the UK have been on the path.
Why would we?
France's lower energy costs. I wrote a paper for the Centre for Policy Studies a couple of months ago. Maybe I can refer that to you. It doesn't have too many charts for you guys in it, but it talks about how rejoining the EU would not solve Britain's growth challenge.
That's some weekend reading there from Gerard Lyons, City Economist and a Senior Fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies, and of course Tom Harwood, a great friend of this podcast, GB News' Deputy Political Editor. Thank you both for joining us today on Chopper's Political Podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, you've heard how all the cash will be raised by Rachel Reeves, what the economists think of it, but how will it be spent? And why does the government often get this so wrong? With me now is Andrew Gilligan, a Senior Fellow and Head of Transport at the think tank Policy Exchange, also a former transport advisor to Boris Johnson, both in London's City Hall and 10 Downing Street. Andrew Gilligan, welcome to our bunker here at GB News, the Chopper's Political Podcast. Great to have you here. Why are our transport schemes so expensive?
Well, look, the HS2 scheme is a particularly bad example of,
and that was in the budget, wasn't it?
Sensationally expensive. So Rachel Reeves gives £1 billion to start tunnelling from Old Oak Common in West London to Euston, but only start. Yes. That's not enough money to actually finish the tunnel, let alone build a station at the other end at Euston, for which they still haven't got any plans, despite having worked on it for 10 years. And that's a kind of sign of the mess we're in over this project. And of course the bit that we are already building between Old Oak Common and the West Midlands, that is now going to cost excessive of £50 billion, and that's more than the whole scheme was supposed to cost, all the way from London to Manchester and Leeds when it was first announced.
So what is going wrong here? Why can't we do it cheaper than, tram schemes on the continent or just schemes elsewhere? Is it because we're a NIMBY country, everyone fights building anywhere near them?
There's a few real reasons. So Britain, particularly southern Britain, or England anyway, particularly southern England, is the most densely populated country in Europe. It's actually even more densely populated than the Netherlands. So lots more people to annoy and disturb. That does make it more expensive.
Yes.
But look, we have built high-speed rail in this country before. We built HS1 to the Channel Tunnel. And that came in at a price that's 2/3 of HS2's in real terms per mile. And we did that because we designed it properly and we awarded the contracts properly. So what they did with HS1, they built it along a motorway corridor along the M20.
Harder to oppose by communities because there's a remote road already there.
Exactly, it was already spoiled. Whereas to save a few minutes on this, they drove it right through the middle of the Chilterns, national landscape, filled with ancient woods and very vocal.
And that means tunnelling.
And it means huge amounts of tunnel. So that on the journey from London to Birmingham, you're only going to be out of a tunnel or cutting for 7 minutes. You're only going to be able to see the sky for 7 minutes. That's why it's so unbelievably expensive. Or one of the reasons. The other main reason it's so enormously expensive is they built it too fast. They built it for a 250 mile an hour line, which is higher, a third higher than the European standard, a third faster. And even though the distances in this country are quite short.
So the idea that it was sold initially then on speed, HS2, and now it's about capacity, freeing up capacity on the West Coast main line. Had it been sold on capacity at the beginning, it may have followed the M40 corridor.
They should have followed the M40 corridor anyway. It would only have taken an extra 2 minutes or so to Birmingham. It's slightly longer, but not much. And as I say, it would have been much, much cheaper to build. And that they've come up now with this justification of capacity. First, I don't actually think the West Coast Main Line is full. I kept asking in government for the evidence that it was, never got shown.
Well, you do get stuck behind slower trains, don't you? Quite a lot, it seems,
what happens,
anecdotally.
Look, I mean, I'm a regular traveller on the West Coast, and it is over. The trains are overcrowded sometimes, but that's not because the line is full. It's because either there aren't enough carriages on the trains. So a typical train from Birmingham to Manchester, for instance, only has 3 or 4 second-class carriages, and even from London to Manchester, quite a lot of the trains only have 5.5. And that's one of the reasons they get overcrowded. You could literally quite easily double and treble the length of the trains by lengthening the platforms. That would literally get you enough capacity to deal with demand for the next 30 years. But even if it is overcrowded, the answer is not to build this massively expensive, massively destructive high-speed line. It's to build a new conventional line, which would be a lot cheaper and a lot more useful because you could put local trains and freight.
George Osborne, one of the architects of HS2, one of the big backers with David Cameron, he says that people always oppose big development like M25 and other things too. And then when it runs, they see property prices tick up in stations nearby, and everyone wonders why they're against it in the first place.
I just think that's wrong. I don't think you've seen the level of opposition to the M25 or the Elizabeth line or anything like. These are the projects it's always compared with, but actually it's telling that they have to justify it by comparing it with completely different projects. So the Elizabeth line is
because
great.
they are unique, aren't they? They're so big, and they are different a bit.
But look, the Elizabeth line is maybe a sixth the size of HS2. It was 18 billion. HS2, if they built it for the full way, would be more than 100. The M25, of course, only cost $1 billion to build. Obviously in 1986 money, so it's probably about 15-20 billion now. But it's comparatively cheap for HS2. And they were genuinely useful, and they were also completely different projects. And it's the sign of the weakness to have to justify it by reference to a completely different project.
There are other issues. I mean, the Lower Thames crossing. Of course, that's to relieve pressure on the Dartford crossing. So that is still not being built, and the money spent so far on just talking about it, which is basically planning, are eye-watering, aren't they, the sums?
The amount they've spent on just doing the planning and the application process is more than Norwegians have spent to build an entire tunnel.
How much is it, do you know?
It's 350, 400 million pounds, something like that. It's
talking about it.
Yeah, just
it's
for the planning.
Unbelievable.
It's quite, and it's nowhere near being started. By the way, we're nowhere near all the way through yet. So it's a huge part of the problem in this country. Everything does cost too much and takes too long.
So are we to blame? Are we to blame? Our listeners, viewers of this podcast to blame? That is a lesson here from an expert like you that we shouldn't be opposing stuff.
I think there's a few things we can do. Firstly, we treat every project as a kind of unique, bespoke project. It's like making a Savile Row suit every time. Actually, what we just need is an off-the-peg approach quite a lot. So, what the French do, for instance, they put in a tram line. They've got a kind of standard template. They don't design a unique tram line for Nantes or something. They just plot down a kind of template tram system they've already done in Bordeaux or something, and that's what we should do. We should do things on a template model. So if you're building a railway or building a road, you'd build it like the railway you just built before. I think that the level of bureaucracy is insane. These literally millions of pages that no one ever reads, that's got to come down. The legal processes to do this. So to get HS2 done, to get any railway or major project done, you need what's called a hybrid bill. You need a special bill of Parliament, which takes years, special committee, special hearings, and it's a stupid way of doing infrastructure projects that no other major country does. But also, look, you've got to choose the right projects. I think that mega projects, on the whole, are just a bad idea anyway. Yes, we could probably do them.
They soothe the egos of politicians,
but they don't help ordinary people. Much more useful than HS2 would be spending money on like thousands of little things.
Well, that's what Rishi Sunak did, actually.
Yeah,
it's
that's
exactly
what we
what he did.
That's what.
Of course, you were number 10 at the time. That's why
when I was in Downing Street, we decided to can the northern section and spend the money instead, 36 billion on lots of little things like bus lanes and tramways and electrification of railways, the existing railways, and that all that kind of stuff just benefits so many more people in so many more places so much more quickly.
Do you think part of the problem is that the politicians aren't honest with voters about this, that they undercook the cost to get things green lighted or green lit, and then they ramp up by the time they get so far? It's like having a builder in. You've got to keep paying a builder to get the job finished, even though you've fallen out with the builder.
That's an absolutely key part of HS2 and lots of other big projects as well. Think about the Olympics, actually. The Olympics, do you remember the Olympics was originally supposed to cost 2.9 billion, I think, ended up costing 9.3. Well, that was a fairly small amount of money by comparison with HS2, and it was something the country wanted as well and was happy with. This was done in exactly the same way. It's called Optimism Bias. You lie or you gloss to be kind about the cost initially to get it started, and then only gradually do you reveal the truth. And that's absolutely the pattern here. So we know for a fact that senior DfT officials misled Parliament about the cost of this thing. Senior DfT officials before the Public Accounts Committee and was asked directly, has the budget gone up? And said, no, the budget is still the same, and also gave a false figure for the benefit cost ratio.
And you're making claims there. Would they deny this?
No, they can't deny it. The committee itself said that this person deceived us. They issued an actual report saying, this is very bad behaviour by this particular.
But there's no fall. There's no fallout. That person is still in place. Is still in a senior role. Because that's what happens. Well. We all want this country to build things which will help us all get better. We want to see a better stuff being built and all working, don't we? I mean, it's not great, but perhaps a more honest conversation about what we're doing, why we're doing it.
We just need to do things. We need to do different things, and we need to do them differently. I believe that small is beautiful. I've always been a massive fan of little projects, bus lanes, roundabouts, bypasses, stuff like that.
No glory there, Andrew Gilligan.
Well, exactly. That's the problem. There's no minister. When I was in number 10, we had this thing called the City Region Sustainable Transport Fund, right, which is basically for mayors and people to do decent stuff, and all they wanted to do is build bus stations. And I say, nobody ever got a bus because it was a nice bus station. They get a bus because it's fast and it's got a bus lane, doesn't get stuck in traffic. But you can't put your name on a plaque on a bus lane, and that was the problem. They wanted to build these massive interchanges.
Let's be proud of bus lanes and the like.
Well, they're boring, they're ordinary, but they really work. That's what happens. That's why the buses in London work, and the rest of the country doesn't. They've got loads of bus lanes.
I've got to ask you, Andrew Gilligan, before you go, about the Tory party briefly. You worked with Boris Johnson for years and years. The party itself is choosing a new leader this weekend, Saturday. Will Boris Johnson ever come back, do you think?
I think there's a possibility, yeah. I think I never say never about these things.
No.
He's got to... I've always said, look, I've always said I think he's got to acknowledge, he's got to understand why he left, and at the moment,
why it went wrong. You mean he was forced out?
He was forced out, and he's gotten. And at the moment, his line basically. I went to his book launch, and his line was there. It was everybody else's fault but mine. Well, of course, it was other people's fault as well.
But you have to recognise your faults.
You have to recognise, that you're part of the reason why it happened. And if you're coming back. And I think there is a possibility, but you have to recognise, you have to show you understand why it went wrong and how it's going to be different this time.
A leopard can change the spots.
Well, who knows?
Andrew Gilligan, former advisor to Boris Johnson, of course, as you heard there, but more importantly right now, the head of Transport, a Policy Exchange and a senior fellow. Thank you for joining us today on Chopper's Political Podcast. Thank you. And thank you to you for listening to, wherever you are, listen to this podcast. And I tweeted Christopher Hope on X. What's your Twitter account?
Mr. Ray Gilligan.
There we are.
Fraction of your followers.
Thank you. Email me on chopper@gbnews.uk. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do tell your friends. If you really enjoyed it, please leave a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify to help other people find it. Thanks to the brilliant team of GB News colleagues behind this podcast, Mick Booker, Jeff Marsh, Rebecca Nunes and George McMillan, and Alice Walker, who's been helping me all week with our budget coverage. And most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. If you want more Chopper in your life, and frankly, who doesn't, catch me during the week on GB News, randomly popping up with political news and comment and analysis, and at midday on Wednesdays for our show PMQs Live with Gloria De Piero, and do keep up to date with our best political reporting on our website, gbnews.com. But until next time, cheerio!